Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Jon Myer Podcast. Today's topic is B2B SaaS Pricing with Dan Balcauski, who's a founder and chief pricing officer at Product Tranquility. Dan's based in Texas, and he focuses on helping high-volume B2B SaaS CEOs define pricing and packaging for new products. Please join me in welcoming Dan to the show. Dan, welcome.
How you doing, John? Good to be here. Excited for our conversation today.
Dan, this is going to be awesome because being that I have a lot of questions myself, I think the audience is going to get a lot of information out of this. Our topic today is B2B SaaS pricing. How about a little backstory on yourself?
Yeah, well, I'll give you the truncated version. Happy to dive into any details I miss. I've been in software my entire 20-year career at this point. I started off more on what I call the value creation side, actually writing code as an engineer, and decided that wasn't the ultimate path for me. The software didn't care how mad I got at it; it still wouldn't run my programs. So ultimately, found myself in engineering management, and then pursued an MBA to learn more about how to actually create value for customers. I found myself on the engineering side, it was very intriguing building high technology products, but I became much more interested on like, how do the products we build actually create value for customers, and how does that turn into dollars and cents for the business? And so post grad school, ended up on the product management, product strategy side of things. I should mention that I got thrown into the pricing world during my business school classes with I didn't realize this till much later. I was quite lucky, realized later that most business schools actually don't have classes in pricing, and I was lucky enough that mine did, and got thrown into that side of the world early on in my internship during my MBA program. Worked for a very successful Silicon Valley startup where kind of on the CEO's desk was a question to whether or not they should pursue a freemium approach. TLDR, I do not recommend freemium for folks. So that was ultimately my recommendation. Worked on that among several other things that summer, and then worked in different levels of seniority on product management, product strategy areas for several different companies. Ultimately, decided to go off my own about 4 years ago, and now all I do is help, like as you mentioned in your intro, high volume B2B SaaS CEOs define pricing and packaging for new and existing products.
Okay, there is a lot to unpack. Now, I don't even know where to start because here's what I'm thinking. I really want to ask you. I got a product or service, and I have a number of them. And I remember sitting there putting out this thing. I'm like, okay, I'm going to offer customer case studies, podcasting, whatever. It's like, what the heck do I charge for this? How do I charge for you versus this person? Everything. I mean, Dan, how do I get started?
Yeah, well, there's so many different areas to go into when it comes to this topic. I think I have a model that I use to help clients through this exact set of challenges. Ultimately, what we need to start out with is really helping understand what are the different customer segments that exist. So there's customer segments are critically important because there's no average customer, there's no average product. If you built an average product, it wouldn't be valuable or useful or differentiated for anyone. So I think too often we lose sight of this, and we immediately want to go to thinking about our product, our features, but really we need to put the customer at the center and really understand that each customer and the context that they're in is going to create different outcomes, different barriers, different context that causes them to value products differently, presents them with a different set of competitive alternatives. And then we had a set of trade-offs on our end to decide, okay, given that's the landscape that we're playing in, how are we going to use that information to strategically choose the different elements of packaging that we'll get into, or ultimately the price level that helps us drive the customer's business. And so all of those elements I mentioned, I use a model. All those elements go into what I call my services model for SaaS pricing. Its services stands for the SVC and S. So segments, value, competition, and strategy, those being the elements I just outlined. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of a handle on where to start. Each of those elements, we could probably spend multiple hours on discussing, but I'll see where you want to go from here.
Actually, I want to understand, and I'm thinking my audience the same deal. They're listening to you, and they have this unique product, right? They have this unique services, and we won't touch on the free stuff yet because I have some questions around that. Like, not only is this free, or should I add this just as a bonus thing? But okay, so I've got a product or services. I've identified and looked at, my audience, my target, where I'm at, where I'm actually kind of the value is for that. Is there more work for me to do in order to identify the right pricing?
Yeah, so I think a lot of this discussion really hinges on, I think, where you are as a company in terms of your stage and maturity, because I'd give very different advice to a company that is just starting out. Ultimately, if in the earliest stages, say, I'll use the term product market fit, even though I don't like it, but it's commonly sort of thought of. If you think about early stages, pre-product market fit, pricing is important, but it's not necessarily the issue that's going to kill you. You should be thinking about things like your unit economics. Are you upside down? And, we're not selling $20 bills for $10. You're going to go out of business pretty quickly. But ultimately, you're not trying to absolutely sort of optimize revenue. This could be very different for a Fortune 500 company, where their planning horizons for market success might be 10 years. They may have, you're working on pricing Cheerios or Coca-Cola. It's not the first time you've had a team of people looking at pricing, right? You're trying to eke out an extra 0.2% of EBITDA next quarter or next year, right? That looks very different than your just starting out of the garage startup company. And so I think one of the things that we want to think about, and so I'm happy to talk about sort of either end of that scale. I tend to play kind of mostly in the middle, what I call this scale up B2B SaaS company. So kind of in the 20 to $100 million range, right? And at the earliest stages, one of the things we want to really think about is, what are our goals? Right? Because people will often ask me, hey, I want to optimize my price. But optimization is a meaningless question without an objective, right? It's like, are you trying to optimize your revenue? Are you trying to optimize your profit? Because ultimately, if we just think about something as simple as your price level, there's not a single number that optimize both of those things simultaneously. So often the company is just confused in terms of, what are you trying to optimize, right? Because we have to understand, it's an old saying, right? If you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there. There's no robust answer to the question of, how do I price this thing unless I align to my objectives. The other thing I think is early on that we want to really get a handle on is something I don't talk about a huge amount in these formats, but is the idea of price positioning. So price positioning, we'll use an example of a market that maybe most of your listeners would be familiar with. Like in the US, we've got the auto market. And so I've got, different kinds of cars, all sorts of different models, but let's just say, at a very high level, I've got sort of your entry level car, your value player is maybe your Toyota Corolla, right? And you've got a number of cars that compete at that space. And then maybe you move to your sort of market or average opportunity, which is your say Toyota Camry. And then above there, you maybe have your premium segment of your market. You've got your BMW, your Mercedes, your Lexus, your Tesla Model S, and then above that, we've got a luxury price point, right? We got Bugatti, Lamborghini, your Tesla Roadster, all the cars that I'm sure you've got parked in your garages, Jon. So why
Yeah,
do we
they're
talk?
out back.
Why do we talk about that? Because I think when we talk about pricing, we can get down in the weeds and talk about, okay, price testing or pricing research, but there's a strategic element of price that we really at the earliest stages need to take into account. Southwest Airlines, right, didn't get to their price point because they did a bunch of market testing. They said, look, this is the price level. This is the competition we wanted to be compared against, because actually it's not just other airlines we're going up against, but we want to be competitive with you hopping on a bus and taking a Greyhound or other cross country point to point route via your car or via a bus. Similarly, when Toyota decided to move up market and compete in a premium segment, they decided to create the Lexus brand, right? And it's like you've got these strategic decisions that then give you sort of these ranges, and I think that's one of the elements that maybe is sort of continued iteration, is like we're always looking at, okay, defining this broad question of like, how do I price in terms of, okay, given the objectives I'm trying to achieve, how do I start thinking in terms of narrowing down my potential ranges, right? So now I'm competing in a premium segment. I invite this set of competition. Now this, if I'm BMW or Mercedes or Lexus, right? There's a defined set of competition. I'm not necessarily trying to attract the market buyers or invite comparisons to the alternatives of the other value segment. So, that's one sort of strategic element that we just kind of take as given. But if you're more early stage, it's something that maybe just goes unsaid more often than not, because people don't really think of it as a decision.
Dan, if you're playing in the medium, right, in the center, then I would kind of assume that if I already have a product or services and I have a pricing or a range of pricing that I'm working with.
I think way too often executives get very much wrapped around the axle on what is the price level. In SaaS pricing, what you charge doesn't determine your success. It's who and how you charge. So one of the things we touched on already was this idea of putting customer segments and customers at the front of the process, really helping to understand like who you're going after. And that helps understand the entire competitive market landscape that you're playing in. But all this discussion around price level, especially in the B2B space, I think it goes it really talks to the very tail end of the process. Like ultimately, yes, you do have to assign a number, but especially in a B2B scenario where there's discounting, there's individual deal level pricing that happens. That number is honestly the easiest to change, both in your business systems and on a deal level. But what's really difficult to change and what's most impactful is actually all of these other elements of how you charge, what we call your packaging in B2B SaaS. So the elements of packaging, I think of them in four types, which is your price model, your price metric, your offer configurations or bundles, and then your price metric, price bundle, office configurations. Oh, and price fences. Sorry. And those elements are, really important because ultimately those are what help you tell your value story. Because I think we get really caught around, when we start talking about price level a little bit too much, we've got that strategic element, like I mentioned, the price positioning. But then all of those elements of packaging are really what's going to help you tell your value story and communicate your value story. Because what you don't want to do is you're having a conversation, say your salesperson is in the room talking to a prospect, and they have they're talking all about the customer, the problem they're trying to solve. Or the customer's like looking at the product, like, oh my God, this thing is the best thing to slice bread. This is going to help here. It's going to help here. I see. This is how I help use it. And then all of a sudden the conversation turns to, well, how do you charge for this thing? What is this thing going to cost me? And the conversation at that point, you imagine the salesperson who has to go, well, here's how you have to understand about how our products architected the back end. And we use, AWS and Azure and a multi-tenant, blah, blah, blah. Right. And all of a sudden the customer's eyes glaze over because all of a sudden you're talking about your product, not the customer's problem. But if the way you price, how you charge, the price metric and how it scales aligns with how the customer gets value, you're selling a marketing automation platform. Oh, how is this thing priced? Well, it's this much per account that you have in your system, so as the number of accounts that you're servicing grows, that's how the pricing scales, right? It's like, oh, because we were talking about sending emails to customers and all of a sudden it's like, okay, yeah, the number of contacts, number of organizations I have in the system, like that makes sense. It has nothing to do with the number of, you can imagine back in the day, you and I may be old enough, at least I was, I'm not going to make a judgment, but you may remember back in the day, perpetual licensed software, a lot of it, but especially the enterprise B2B world, but priced by the number of CPU cores,
Yep.
right, or things like that, and you're just like,
VMware was known for it. Sorry, no, a little plug-in for VMware, but I think one of the things when you start talking about an architecture and not actually their problem in your example, all I'm thinking about is this is too expensive for me. Great conversation. I'll see you.
Yeah. So you don't want to, it's just you hear that. What's the record skip in the?
Yep.
It's just like all the wheels fall off because all of a sudden it's now about, it's not no longer about the customer's problem. And so I think, one of the things we really want to help folks, your audience understand and as well, implement in their businesses is, look, that ultimate price point, you've got a lot of flexibility, right? And I think it gets way too much analysis. And look, ultimately, that's where a lot of clients start when they come to me, right? Or any sort of conversation around pricing is, should this be $20 user? Should be $100 user? Should be $29.95? Should I price it in fives and nines? Look, I love those conversations. They're super fun. But ultimately, I think you're starting at the very end of the process. And there's a whole bunch more area that is even more important to nail. And because it's going to be impactful for that conversation. And it's going to be much more difficult to change going forward. So it's very important to get that correct up front.
When customers come to you, what are some of the first questions you actually ask them to get to know them more and understand their pricing, their services, and what approach you should take?
Ultimately, look, for any pricing change, I'm going to start with what are they trying to achieve? Pricing is simple, but it's not easy. So ultimately, any pricing change, when we go into it, we have to understand what is the expected change in revenue? What's the expected change in costs? So most folks aren't coming to me when those variables are within a pretty understandable range of values, or there's very little risk of the decision. You're not coming to a consulting firm if you're just debating a 5% price increase. Just go and change the pricing 5%, and we'll be done with it. Where folks come to me in our firm is there's something more structural going on, right? So there's elements of we're grown beyond our initial target customer segment, and the new segment that we're talking to, our pricing and packaging doesn't make any sense. It doesn't align with the value that those customers get out of the product, or things like we are starting to experience incredible headwinds from changing macro environment, especially if you've got a misaligned pricing metric. So pricing metric would be something like charging per user or per API transaction or per amount of data stored, right? So you see this data stored would be like for Dropbox, for example, or AWS is going to charge you for how much computer time you use on an EC2 instance, right? And it scales with that. Well, if you've got a business that relies on seat expansion to grow, well, in an economic environment when people are removing seats because they're lowering headcount, unfortunately, what was a nice tailwind to your business is now a headwind, right? And in a rush to gain market share during a heady days of expansionary economic times, folks have really started to realize we added all this additional functionality and we didn't actually have any conversations about monetizing it. And so, not only are people not adding seats, they're removing seats, and we've given them such powerful tools that actually the people they've left can actually do more with less. So we've sowed the seeds of our own demise. And so we're, the question kind of starts around what is sort of those contexts, and then trying to help them understand, okay, well, what does good look like? What is the other side of this, right? Because ultimately, we don't want to go. Make no bones about it. A packaging change can be pretty disruptive if you're, so we want to make sure, look, on the other side of this, we think that there's a good return, right? This is, and so we're looking at where's this causing friction? Is there current pricing and packaging? Is it extending sales cycle times? Is it keeping conversion rates down? Is it preventing you from increasing things like net revenue retention, or keeping a lid on that growth? And so ultimately, that's kind of where we start, is helping understand what are all the factors that they're hoping to achieve, and then as we break that down, we're looking at what is the different elements that we can kind of attack given the different levers I laid out previously.
Well, Dan, what are some of the things that people get wrong about pricing?
Well, I already mentioned one, which is the focus on what you charge instead of who and how you charge. I think another one is ultimately it really, you don't have a choice of whether or not you will have a pricing conversation. You only really have a choice of when you will have a pricing conversation. So ultimately, I think too many. This could get into a little bit more of a philosophy element, because I think product managers have a really hard job, and I think the function has grown a lot over time in terms of its maturity, but too often pricing is not taught as an element of the product management curriculum, whether it's a boot camp or other formalized training, because it's very different to ask a customer, hey, do you want this feature, versus do you want this feature for $10, right? Because those activate two very different parts of your brain work, those questions. And so I think there's a aspect of the product management and product development process where we really need to think about putting the pricing conversation at the beginning, right? Or at least having it involved from the beginning, because somehow, I've seen the slides that have this in terms of talking about a go-to-market launch plan. Somehow pricing and packaging got slotted in at 60 days pre-launch. Someone decides what pricing and packaging should be.
And then you're struggling.
And that's why I get a phone call. People are like, "Oh, well, I look to the left and look to the right, and nobody ever asked anybody about pricing." And I was like, "Well, you guys spent how many millions of dollars on R&D to build this product, and nobody asked the customers what they'd be willing to pay for it?" Right? Again, in the most helpful way possible. Right? It's like ultimately we should all be building products that people want, right? And so one of the ultimate, and look, we could have a very nuanced debate as well, because the easy answer to this is like, well, but people never say what they'd actually pay for something. It's like, yeah, okay, researchers in this space have known that for 60 years, and we've developed a whole bunch of techniques to get around that. And like, we can go down that rabbit hole if you want. I think that's that's the easy response to this, but ultimately, like, we all have this ability to make trade-offs in how we think about our purchase decisions and what we will do. And while the absolute numbers at different levels may not be, the God's honest truth, the bedrock, at least we'll have had a conversation and we can understand, relative ranges and have relative ranges of certainty around it. But if we never ask the question, we're just guessing.
Well, asking the question from the beginning, I want to touch on the features that you were kind of talking about. Like they're developed, they spend all these millions of dollars for features and never ask the customer if they want them. Is there a balance between adding features for customers that are included in their current pricing, or adding an additional and charging money on top of it? Is there like, do you help customers with that? Do you help them understand that, like, hey, listen, you should have asked this question in the beginning. You didn't. Now you have these features. I have 10 new features. I think we should charge a customer. No, we should give 5 to them for free. Like, how do you balance?
Yeah. So ultimately, look, it depends. There's going to be a bunch of different scenarios depending upon the level of sort of due diligence done to that point. A lot of it comes back to, one, fundamentally, is the company in a position where they're regularly having that conversation? Because my experience has been that that's not kind of par for the course. The default tends to be that product management is going and creating value. Marketing is focused on mostly performance marketing, customer acquisition. Sales is looking at selling what we've got and the existing, if anything, trying to put downward pressure on pricing. And no one's really minding the store in terms of additional monetization opportunities. So I would be very happy in a company where at least that conversation is being had. So that being said, a lot of it comes back to something I already mentioned, which is, look, well, what was your hypothesis when you went into this? What is your goal? Like, what are you trying to do? You went and built 10 new features. Was the goal because we thought these would be a brand new add-on or a new offer? They would justify an enterprise offer configuration if we bundled them in. So a lot of it's going to depend upon what are your goals. This is the flip side of what I just mentioned before. So that like CRM is an example, because that's if you're buying Salesforce, it's traditionally sold in a seat basis. That's that situation where clients have gotten into in the past where they didn't have the conversation. They just add features because this idea of, hey, we just want to grow, get market share, add value, make it a no-brainer for customers to want to go with us. And then they end up in a sad situation when the economy turns, where they realize, like, oh, we've now created and shipped all this value that we never monetized. It's a little bit difficult to put the genie back in the bottle. This is one of the arguments against freemium. I have many arguments against freemium, but this is one of them, because it's very difficult to put the genie back in the bottle. If you're doing your product management job correctly, you probably built the most important functionality first, and then you gave it away. And so now turning around and trying to say, oh, now we're going to charge for it, it's not impossible. But, especially if you have a purely free product, you're going to have some backlash. But, you've also taught the market that it wasn't worth anything. Right. So I think that's the other thing, is that you've set the, we value and price are incredibly related. They're not the same thing. But, and we could go into that discussion if you want, but ultimately, we do help educate the market on what our value is by the prices of things we set, which is why pricing too low can often be a negative signal. It's like we think, oh man, I'm going to price this low and I'm going to win market share. Depends what market you're in. If I'm in a B2B deal, price is usually not the dominant decision factor. In fact, for most studies I've seen, it's somewhere between the third and the seventh most important factor. The buyer on the other side of that table, he's worried he's going to lose his job if he recommends your product and it doesn't work out, or the company doesn't get the value, or you never get it implemented, or there's some other issue. There's a bunch of other risk that's involved. You having a low price is just adding to his risk side of the calculation. It's not necessarily a net benefit. He's just worried, like, oh my God, at this price, is this company going to be around in a year? Because
yeah, that's actually very true. That's a good statement. I mean, you think about it. Here's how I think about it. In an enterprise level, you're in a B2B. Nobody's looking at the price until you submit it. They're looking at the product and be like, shit, as an engineer, I am recommending this product, or I'm recommending this product. And you're saying, oh, it's only for 1,000. I'll give you a discount 500. And you're like, okay, that's not my concern. I would happily pay 100,000, but if you know what I mean?
Absolutely.
Dan, let me go back to the free a little bit, because I have some questions on it, and I'm thinking it from a SaaS product point of view. There's a certain portion of a free product that you can utilize up to a certain amount. Somebody like, you can do X, Y, and Z, and after that, it costs for any of that. Does that fit under your concerns against free? Yep. Does that fit under your concerns?
Yes, that fits under my concerns.
Why?
So ultimately, free. So the better answer, anytime anyone's saying freemium, the better answer is almost universally free trial, with a couple of limited exceptions. So the idea of free trial and freemium are very related. So we didn't talk about different types of value in this conversation, but very quickly, the idea of having a free trial or freemium increases a customer's perceived value of the product. And because software is what economists would term an experience good. So an experience good, your value perception changes as you use the product. And so you run into, this is not just software, but you imagine you go get a haircut, right? Or you go eat at a restaurant. Like a lot of those, unless you're not, say a new haircut or a new restaurant, right? Unless you go to McDonald's, right? You pretty much know what you're going to get, right, up front. But you go into a new restaurant, you go and get a haircut, right? We can't judge the fact. There are goods, they're called credence goods, that actually, even after we've consumed the product, we can't judge the effectiveness. Actually, like if you've ever hired a lawyer, I mean, maybe a really bad lawyer, you'd be able to tell, but like, you're like, I don't know if I could tell a good lawyer from a great lawyer, like, honestly, so like I pay all this money and it's like, I don't know, did you get your money's worth? I have no idea. But software, it falls in this category of an experience good, where perception of value changes. And so, look, a free trial definitely hits the lizard brain in a way that no matter how good your marketing team is with videos and white papers and webinars and podcasts, it just doesn't click for you until you see your data in there. You're like, oh my God, now I get it. Right? You have that aha moment, right? That activation moment that we talk about in product management a lot. That being said, free forever is generally not a good idea. It causes all sorts of problems. So number one, I think this idea that these free users, and we're talking about free, this distinction between users and customers becomes important, because customers are actually ones that give you money. Free users and paying customers, the idea that your customers are the same as these free forever users, I just haven't seen that be the case. Because ultimately, what I see is a lot of like, oh, well, at some point, these people will grow into real businesses. Well, I've seen a lot of it not be that, where you have these B2B SaaS companies and the people using the free side are like families using it for personal use. And it's like, I guess maybe dad at some point will quit his corporate job and become an entrepreneur, and then, have a 100-person business and then become, part of your ICP. But like, that's a long road, and you probably got other things that you could focus on in the interim. It causes a lot of internal problems because it's really, really difficult to acquire new customers. I get that. All CMOs and growth marketers out there working really hard every day. And you have this mirage of free users that you think, oh, well, we can just go add this one more feature to the product, tweak our onboarding, throw a couple of different, whatever it might be, whatever tactic number 57 you think is going to finally move that cohort. It's just almost never the case. Best in class freemium companies, they convert about 1% to 3% of their users, which also means that you need a massive, massive market in order for it to make sense in a B2B case. Keep in mind the context that I'm coming from. All the work I do these days is B2B. So B2C, if you're in consumer, maybe you have a little bit better of an argument. I still think there's problems there, but I think the track record isn't as pristine as some people would make it out to be. But in it's one of these tactics I think is maybe in B2C it works well. Bring it over to B2B is just not a great idea. But a free trial, great idea. This other element, again, having been a product guy for so long, I think not only about it from a pricing perspective, but thinking about it from a customer experience perspective, because I think it's very easy to get in this swan song of, $0 marginal cost to serve. Well, yeah, but that's only the case if you're not supporting these customers, these users. So what do you want your experience to be on the free side? These people have a problem. Are you going to, can they call someone? Can they email somebody? And a lot of the people will be like, well, no. It's like, well, I don't know. Like, that's not a great experience. Like, I don't have a very high view of you. Like, you want me to eventually buy, right? Isn't that the whole strategy? Like, shouldn't I have like a great, think a lot about your company for you just to be like, I don't care about your problems or your bug that you found. Like, I can't get anybody to talk to you. Versus a free trial. Well, look, we're rolling out the red carpet. The sales team is at your beck and call. Oh, what do you need, sir? Let me see if I can get an engineer on this call to get that software working the right way for you. Like, because tomorrow good for you. Like, we'll get a call. Whatever it might be. So just from that perspective, I think just the strategy isn't well thought through. And so, look, there's a couple of very limited areas where the freemium approach works. One of them, which is actually, you and I are both podcasters. I found I use Buzzsprout. I'll give them their pricing and packaging could use some use some work, but they do have a freemium option. And one of the reasons why it makes sense in their case is, for anyone who hasn't started a podcast before, so you have to go set up all of your connections with RSS feeds with Apple and iTunes and Spotify and Google Podcasts, etc. So with some of those, there's a very lengthy registration process that's undefined on behalf of those of when they're going to recognize, and so look, if you're in a 7-day free trial, like, God knows if Apple's going to get back to you within that 7-day window. Also, like, there's a bunch of pre-work I need to do to make sure the podcast is ready to go. I might not start producing episodes for a couple of months. In that time, like, I'm really not a qualified lead. Like, yeah, maybe I've got a 2-minute trailer just to make sure, just to announce to the world that my podcast exists and make sure the RSS feed and my website's set up. But like, I'm not actually, generating revenue or anything. So in that case, like, do I want to have a sales team extending me free trial keys? And this argument also applies, like, in a lot of the API developer world. You may have a product that's just for developers. Those developers are going to have to use your product in, 3, 6, 9, 12 months, just in staging or development. They're not rolling that out to production. And so in that case, they're not a lead yet either. And you don't want to have a sales team constantly have to extend free trials. You just have a free version of the product that no one would ever be stupid enough to roll into production, because it would just fall over and make their whole production system not work, So, but in that case, that's where kind of a free trial or freemium approach, limited free option could work.
I think you summarized my experience working in enterprise. I was literally like the engineer. Hey, I just want to test out your product a little bit. Yeah, sure. Here's a key for you. Yeah, the 60 days are up. Can I get another one for that? Literally, I swear that was my experience.
Yeah.
So Dan, let me switch gears here before we wrap things up. I want to talk about value and pricing.
Oh, just a quick light topic on value.
Yeah. I mean, I'm talking about we've got 10 minutes, so that's why I said wrap things up.
Okay.
Let's talk about value.
What do you want to know?
I'm leaving the door for you, man. You're educating me. Like, what are you defining as value?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So, the I deal with a lot of education around value because it's so foundational to pricing. I fundamentally believe that intelligent pricing management comes from intelligent value management, but we can't have a discussion about either if we don't have a coherent conversation about what value is. So I use a framework that I didn't create, but came from a gentleman named Tom Nagel. He wrote one of the seminal books on pricing. It's kind of the Bible of pricing, called The Strategy and Tactics of Pricing. It's in like the 6th, 7th, or 8th edition at this point. Really quite intense of a read, but if you really want to do some serious work in this space, highly recommend it. He created something was called the value cascade. And so if you think about the value cascade, cascade is another term for waterfall. If we think about a series of bar chart where every sort of bar is slightly lower than the next, that's the visual you may have in mind. And all the way on the left, he introduces this idea of what's called use value. And so use value is the sum of all benefits that you may get from a product. So when we think about using a product, there are different types of value drivers that we get. And I think another framework that I layer onto this is called jobs to be done. And so oftentimes in the business world, the B2B world, we think about functional value drivers. So these are things like, it's going to help make me money, it's going to save me money or save costs, it's going to reduce time, it's going to reduce risk, reduce operating capital, increase compliance. Those would be sort of functional benefits because they're functional outcomes. Jobs to be done doesn't leave us there. There's a whole other two classes of emotional jobs that has two subcategories, which is social jobs and emotional personal jobs. So personal jobs are the jobs that help us create an emotional outcome. So, we think about this in terms of the value of, like, what's the value of a Rolex versus a Timex? Both keep the same functional time, but one is going to signal something about your status to others, right? And that's an emotional benefit, right? And that's what most luxury goods are competing against, is some type of emotional benefit. This is happens a lot in when we think about heavily commoditized. College football season just started. I'm a big fan. I don't know how many commercials for car insurance I just watched over the last weekend, because it seems like every other commercial is car insurance. And I don't know anything about Progressive or Nationwide or any of these other policies, right? All of them are just make me laugh, right? Why are they all trying to do that? Because they're trying to make insurance funny. And some of them are really good at it, and some of them are really
Stay away
terrible.
from mayhem like me.
Exactly. So you see that in heavily commoditized markets, right? But they try to compete more on an emotional benefit, right? Coca-Cola is trying to convince you that Coca-Cola equals happiness, and De Beers is trying to convince you that diamonds equal forever love, right? But then also there's this idea of social jobs. So the benefit of humans is not that we are not just out for ourselves, but also we do things that are pro-social in nature and have social outcomes. These would be things like advocating for access to better healthcare, better education, environmental goals, whatever, suffrage for traditionally disenfranchised groups, right? And so those things also have value. So this is all rolls under what Nagel terms as use value. So this helps us frame value in a very concrete context. But the story doesn't end there. The next step of the value cascade is what's called exchange value. And exchange value is important because use value, while helping us really understand at a detailed level what the benefits are and how we should think about, adding different types of benefits together, ultimately use value is never relevant for a pricing exercise because we live in a market economy. And so the fact is that a large proportion of the use value in your market already has a market price associated with it. So I'll use this example. It's fun. So imagine We got the cast of Gilligan's Island. For those of you who maybe don't remember Gilligan's Island, we'll use Elon Musk. Unfortunately, these poor folks were trapped on a desert island for many years, and one of them on there was a millionaire, probably a billionaire, Mr. Howell. So we'll just say Elon's trapped on a desert island. So Elon's trapped on a desert island. He's turning, he's made friends with a volleyball. Right, he's going crazy. Eventually, a ship captain shows up. So the question is how much should Elon pay the ship captain to get off that island? The answer is all of his money plus all the money he can beg, borrow, and steal once he gets back from the island, because his dollars are doing him no good perpetually on that island. Okay, but let's assume ship captain number 2 shows up. Ship captain number 2 says, hey, Elon, you don't have to pay me billions of dollars to get off here. I'll do it for a cool million. Okay, now there's a market price. So all of the other value that was, intangible has now become tangible. And now ship captain 1 has a decision to make. He can say, I'll match that price. I'll bow out of this entirely. I'll match that price. Or maybe I can get 1.1. Hey, Elon, actually, you should come with me. I've got a catamaran. It'll be a smoother ride. You can use my ship captain's quarters. I'll serve you meals every night. Right, you'll have a more enjoyable experience. Oh, by the way, I've got a mariachi band here. They'll have entertainment for us, and as much alcohol as you can drink. And so now, what are they doing? They're talking about there's the market price, and now the ship captain 1's talking about differentiated value. Right, and so he's being very explicit around this is the benefits above and beyond what you're going to get with this other person. So there's the market price plus, I'm going to assign a price of 1.1 an additional $100,000 of differentiated positive value, right? And there's more nuanced ways to have that as well. And then the third aspect of the cascade is what we call perceived value. So ultimately, humans are not spreadsheets. We're not calculators. The world is way too complex for us to individually tally up every possible value driver when we're making a decision. And look, there's a more nuanced conversation we can have as well of how, if you're on the sales side, you're doing sales enablement, there are ways to help tell that story more effectively. But as buyers, we're not, a lot of times, let's use a CRM example, your VP of sales, your direct told you as a director of sales, hey, we need a new CRM. Can you go shopping? So what do? You don't go evaluate every single product on the market and set up demos with everyone and document every feature and make this your life's work. You go ask a couple of buddies what they use. Maybe you go to G2 or Trust Radius or one of these other review sites, right? You get some short lists. You figure out like, oh, well, I went to whatever Salesforce's website and it said on there that, JP Morgan and Disney and Sony use theirs, right? You use logo gardens, right? Use some social proof. There's some customer testimonials, right? So all of these things are shortcuts, not because humans are lazy, just because the world's too complicated, right? And so although we'd like to, have this rational economic mind, ultimately we can only deal with so much complexity. And so I think where perceived value is incredibly important is our ability to influence perceived value as marketers is a lever that I don't think, is fully realized, right? So there's that element, and ultimately perceived value is the only thing that drives willingness to pay. So the value cascade ties together this world of value, being very precise about what each step of value actually means, leading us into an understanding of, okay, willingness to pay is fundamentally driven by what customers' perception is, right? Perception is, at most what the sort of exchange value is going to be. Exchange value at most what the, use value utility is going to be.
Dan, that was a tremendous explanation of that, because so many questions popped in my head that I don't even have time to ask. Not only the value, the first person to market really sets the value, but the second person to market, then the market pricing and everything change. How does that work? How do you compete? The differentiating factors, like, you may not have the first thing to the market, but what are your differentiating factors out there that allow you to set yourself apart, and why are you better than the other person and able to charge more? Those things are all going to come into effect. Dan, I got to wrap things up. I think we got to come back on. We got to dive more, not only into this, but some other topics. What do you say?
I would love to. It'd be great, John.
I've got so many questions, man. I know we were just so this is the whole thing about doing these types of podcasts is to have just natural style conversations. Dive into it wherever the questions go to the fore. Everybody, let me just reintroduce Dan, wrap things up, and I really appreciate it. So everybody, Dan Balcauski is the founder and chief pricing product officer at Product Tranquility. Dan, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me, John. I appreciate the time.
All right, everybody, this has been the Jon Myer Podcast. Don't forget to hit that like, subscribe, and notify because guess what? We're out of here.